holding part of it until he sensed that the time was right. Now, many years earlier, when Abraham was given the covenant promise by God, one of the elements of the covenant included that Abraham was going to become the father of a great nation. Now, if we look back at Genesis 12:2, perhaps you will remember that I told you that the Hebrew word used for nation there was goy. And that when goy is used, it means Gentile nation, or goyim, Gentile nations, plural. However, I want to parse that just a little bit more. In Abraham's time, to take the word goy or goyim to mean strictly non-Hebrew nations would have had no meaning, because until Isaac was born, there was no distinction between Hebrew and non-Hebrew nations produced by Abraham. That is, although Abraham is called the first Hebrew, it was with the birth of his sons Ishmael and Isaac that the first fork in the road, the differentiation between Hebrew and non-Hebrew offspring, actually occurred, with Isaac being the Hebrew, Ishmael and all other sons and daughters of his being non-Hebrews. So a goy, goyim, used in chapter Genesis 12:2, and in the earliest development of the Hebrew people, is referring to both Hebrew and non-Hebrew nations, just nations at large without regard to being a Hebrew or non-Hebrew. But now coming back to Genesis 28, verse 3, we see what happens to be, what appears to be, the same blessing that God gave to Abraham and then Abraham gave to Isaac, now being transferred by Isaac to Jacob. But there's an important difference, where most Bibles say that Isaac said to Jacob something like, that you may become a company of people or a company of nations. The Hebrew for a company of people or company of nations is kahal amim. Kahal amim. This is entirely different than what God promised to Abraham and what was promised to Isaac. That is, that they would produce goyim, a mixture of nations. Because kahal amim, in its most literal translation, is used in Hebrew as the opposite of what God had told Abraham. Literally, kahal amim means a holy convocation or a holy assembly of fellow countrymen. In other words, it means an assembly of people for holy purposes, consisting of people, however, from the same tribe or the same group of tribes. That is, Jacob, who would soon be renamed to Israel, will be the first one in the line of the covenant promise who would produce as his offspring only Hebrews. He will produce only nations of Hebrew people, only people who would be called by the time of Moses God's precious treasure. I want to summarize that again so you get it. Abraham produced, as children, Hebrew and non-Hebrew offspring, just as God promised him in Genesis 12:2, with Isaac being the Hebrew. Abraham's son Isaac then went on to produce Hebrew and non-Hebrew children, with Jacob being the Hebrew. But Jacob now, he will produce only Hebrews, all the tribes of Israel, which is exactly what the blessing of a kahal amim, a holy convocation of fellow countrymen, that's what that's telling us. Well, moving on, beginning in verse 6. We are told that Esau observed that Isaac sent Jacob to Mesopotamia to get his wife because his father detested Canaanite women. Poor Esau. He's already taken 2 Canaanite wives. which had greatly displeased his father, and now in a misguided, almost comical attempt to make amends, he goes to his father's brother's family, Esau's uncle Ishmael, the son that Abraham had sent away. And Esau takes now an Ishmaelite woman for a third wife. What a knucklehead. But as a matter of fact, as this event is told to us, its future effect is beyond calculation. Because here we have an alliance through intermarriage formed. It bonds the two, think about this, the two dispossessed firstborns, rejected by Jehovah as the possible heirs to the covenant land of promise, Ishmael and Esau. It bonds them together into what will rather quickly turn into a permanent anti-Israel group of nations. It is the alliance and gene pool mixing of Ishmael with Esau who forms the vast bulk of Islam in the world today, and the entire bulk of Arabs. This report of such few words in verse 9 radically altered the course of history. And it set in motion the circumstances that are going to bring about the Antichrist and the end of history as we know it. Well, Jacob leaves Beersheba. He travels about